Some debts aren't written in ink, they're carried in silence. Harrison Ford hadn't heard the name Rebecca Morgan in over 5 years, but one quiet morning in a snowy Wyoming hospital, he heard a child's voice say, "Please save my mommy." That was enough to stop him mid-step, enough to awaken a memory buried in snow and a promise he never got to keep. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The hallway of Jackson Hole General felt colder than usual that Monday morning. The kind of cold that clung to your bones, even inside. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale sheen across sterile floors. Nurses moved briskly, clipboards in hand. A wheelchair squeaked. Somewhere down the corridor, a vending machine clicked to life. Routine sounds of a small-town hospital beginning another long day. Then came the voice, soft, fragile, trembling like frost on a windowpane. "Please save my mom. I promise I'll pay when I grow up." The hallway fell silent. Conversations paused. The nurse at the reception turned. A doctor mid-stride slowed. Even the man replacing the water cooler lid froze, fingers curled mid-motion. Near the double doors to the emergency wing stood a girl no taller than a chair. Brown curls tangled from sleep, cheeks smudged with dirt and dried tears. She clutched a weathered teddy bear to her chest like a shield, the fur worn bare around its stitched eye. Her other hand was wrapped tightly around the white coat of a doctor who hadn't even looked down yet. She had latched onto him with every ounce of strength in her tiny frame. Her knuckles were white. Her voice, though soft, had pierced the air like a fire alarm because it wasn't just words. It was the sound of desperation that no adult could fake. "Please," she whispered again, this time just for him. "Please save her. I don't have any money, but I can pay when I'm big." The doctor, startled, finally turned. He knelt down slowly, speaking in a voice reserved for moments when nothing in medical school applied. "Sweetheart," he said, "we're doing everything we can, okay? What's your name?" But the girl didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the doors where her mother had just disappeared. She clutched Mr. Bear tighter. At the far end of the hallway, a man stood still. He hadn't meant to stop. He had an appointment. A routine checkup on his shoulder, nothing urgent. He'd walked these halls before, unnoticed, just another aging man in an old jacket and dark fedora. People didn't recognize him much anymore. And that was just the way he liked it. But the girl's voice had hit him in a place too deep to ignore. He stood there, motionless, hands in his coat pockets, watching Harrison Ford. Once, years ago, he'd flown helicopters into places most pilots feared to map. He'd pulled hikers off cliffs, rescued lost children from canyons during whiteouts. He'd been the voice on the radio saying, "Hold on, I'm coming." But today, he was nobody, just a man with an old injury and too many memories. He watched the girl struggle to hold herself together, her small shoulders shaking under a too thin hoodie. No one else noticed her shivering. No one else stepped forward. He took one slow breath, the kind you take before opening a door you're not sure you want to walk through. He didn't move yet, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And caring had a way of pulling you into storms you couldn't fly out of. Behind him, a nurse asked someone to move along. Phones rang, life resumed, but the man in the old hat stayed exactly where he was, watching, waiting, and listening to the echo of a little girl's plea as if it had been meant for him. Harrison Ford sat alone in the waiting area just past the entrance, the kind of place filled with old magazines and bad coffee. He had just finished with the nurse practitioner, a checkup on the shoulder that still gave him trouble some days, remnants from a crash no one else seemed to remember anymore. These days, people asked more about movie trivia than flight paths. He didn't correct them, let the past sleep. His jacket was zipped halfway up, his hat tilted low. The hospital's heating system clanged somewhere in the ceiling. He checked the time. If he left now, he could be home before the snow started again. He rose, stiffly, making his way toward the parking lot doors. Just another Monday, just another errand, just another place to leave behind. But halfway down the corridor, he paused. Something felt off. The hallway was alive again with movement. Orderlies rolled a gurney past. A nurse muttered about a broken printer. Voices resumed. But for Harrison, there was still a ringing silence in his ears, the kind that doesn't come from sound, but from something deeper. A memory, or maybe a warning. He hesitated at the glass exit door, hand resting on the metal push bar. That should have been the end of it. He should have kept walking, and maybe on any other day he would have. But then he heard it. "Please save my mommy." Not shouted this time, not spoken aloud in the hallway, but coming faintly through the small wall speaker just above the waiting room, a crackle of sound from the hospital's internal radio loop. Someone had left a comm line open, just a child's voice, caught by accident and now echoing through sterile walls. The same words, the same tone, but this time they cut deeper. He froze. Slowly, he turned his head toward the speaker. The voice was fading now, someone muttering to switch the channel, static returning. But it was too late. The words had landed. He let go of the door. The walk back down the hall was slower. He didn't rush. If anything, he moved as if unsure whether he had the right to return. He passed the vending machines, the reception desk, the wall-mounted hand sanitizer dispenser. Everything exactly as before, but something inside him had shifted. As he turned the corner, he saw her again. The little girl, Lily. She was sitting now, knees pulled to her chest, clutching her bear with both arms like it might dissolve if she let go. Her eyes were locked on the double doors to the emergency wing, unmoving, unblinking. As if watching could bring her mother back faster, he didn't approach. Not yet. He simply stood there, watching her from a quiet distance. Then he heard the nurse's voice nearby. "What's your mother's name, honey?" The girl whispered something. The nurse leaned closer. "Can you say it again?" "Rebecca," Lily murmured. "Rebecca Morgan." And Harrison Ford stopped breathing, not visibly, not dramatically, just a stillness that took over his entire body. That name, Rebecca Morgan, the sound of it was like a match striking in a long dark room. Something ignited. He hadn't heard it in years, but he'd never forgotten it. Couldn't. It was written on a memory, carved in snow and blood and pain. A name whispered through frostbitten lips. A name that had stayed with him long after he was rescued, long after the reports were filed, and the story forgotten by everyone else. Everyone except him. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the floor. No one else in this hospital knew what that name meant to him. No one else knew the weight it carried. He didn't come here today expecting this. He'd come for his shoulder, maybe some peace and quiet, certainly not this, but fate never asked for permission. And now the name had returned, with it the memory, and with the memory came a truth he could no longer walk away from. So Harrison Ford did what he hadn't done in a very long time. He turned around and walked back into someone else's storm. The hospital cafe was nearly empty, save for the distant hiss of a steam wand and the quiet clinking of spoons on ceramic. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow and soft, blanketing the windows in a hush that matched the silence inside. Harrison Ford sat at the corner table, elbows resting on the worn wood, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Across from him, Lily hunched over a paper napkin, drawing carefully with a dull red pencil. Mr. Bear sat perched beside her cup of apple juice, observing as if supervising the art. She hadn't said much. Just a shy nod when he'd asked if she was hungry. A quiet thank you when he placed the hot chocolate in front of her. Now she was deep in her own world, sketching something with a kind of solemn focus far too mature for her age. Harrison watched her without speaking. There was something about her stillness, the way she bit her lower lip as she colored, that reminded him of long flights, those moments of waiting in the cockpit, listening to nothing but wind and instinct. After a while, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his old leather wallet. It creaked open, worn thin at the seams. From behind the stack of weathered cards and faded photographs, he slid out a small square of fabric, gray, stained, edges frayed from time and memory. A piece of emergency bandage folded tight. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, as though it might disintegrate, and there, faint but still visible, was the thing that had never left his mind. Black marker, capital letters, R. Morgan. He remembered the cold first, the kind that sank through bone. He'd gone down in the Wind River Range, a rescue mission gone wrong, helicopter clipped by a gust of impossible wind, trees, screaming metal, then silence. He came to with his leg twisted, ribs shattered, shoulder torn. The pain was there, but the cold numbed it. What he remembered next was her voice. Firm, focused, not loud, but unshakable. "Don't close your eyes, we're not done yet." She was young, maybe 25, dressed in heavy snow gear, face hidden behind goggles and frost. He hadn't known her name. She hadn't offered it, just worked. She splintered his leg, wrapped his shoulder, shoved protein bars into his hand. And when the radio failed and the storm cut them off, she pulled him onto a sled made from salvaged gear and dragged him for miles. Through sleet, over ice, past a ridge no one sane would attempt in that weather. For 2 days she never slept, barely spoke, just moved forward. And sometime during that second night, when the fever took hold and he began to drift, she wrote her name on his bandage. Maybe she thought it would be the only way someone would know who'd tried to save him. He'd read it, half-conscious, and burned it into memory. R. Morgan, no first name, no hometown. Just the initials and the will of someone who didn't give up. The search teams found them on the 3rd day. She was nearly unconscious, body curled over his to keep him warm. She vanished after that. No medal, no interview, just gone. But the name stayed, and so did the bandage. Now, 5 years later, he sat across from her daughter. Lily had switched colors. She was using green now, drawing what looked like trees. Her fingers moved carefully, avoiding the rip in the napkin. He looked back down at the cloth in his hand. It was a relic, a reminder, a debt buried in snow, thawing now under hospital lights. He folded it again and slid it back into his wallet. He didn't know what had brought Rebecca Morgan to this small-town hospital. Didn't know what kind of life she had lived after saving his. But he knew one thing, as certain as he had ever known anything. The woman who had once pulled him out of the snow had just been wheeled through those double doors. And the only person left to pull her daughter through now was him. The waiting room had grown quiet as the sun dipped behind the snowy hills. Outside, the first flakes of evening snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the parking lot and muffling the world. Inside, under the dim yellow lights, Lily sat curled in the corner chair, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Mr. Bear rested in her lap, tucked beneath her chin like a secret. Her fingers traced the same patch of worn fabric over and over, as if afraid the bear would vanish if she let go. Harrison Ford stood by the doorway, hat in hand, watching. It had been hours since Rebecca was wheeled into surgery. The nurses had come and gone. The lights in the hallway flickered once, then settled, but the girl had not moved. She hadn't asked for food, hadn't said a word. He approached the nurse's station, cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, voice low, almost uncertain. "The girl, Lily, she shouldn't be alone." The young nurse glanced at the clipboard in her hands. "Are you family?" "No," he said after a pause. "But I owe her mother a long time ago." She looked at him again. The kind of look people give older men with weathered faces and quiet voices. A judgment not of danger, but of distance, a man who carried too much silence. She studied his eyes for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "All right," she said softly. "You can stay, but don't leave her alone." "I won't." He returned to the chairs, sat down slowly, with that careful ease that comes from age and injuries that never quite healed. Lily didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the door her mother had gone through. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Harrison leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you like stories?" he asked, his voice as gentle as snowfall. Lily glanced at him, just barely. He nodded toward Mr. Bear. "He looks like he's heard a few." She shrugged. "I used to tell stories," he said, "back when I flew helicopters, sometimes to keep people calm, sometimes to stay calm myself." Still no reply. "There was one," he said, eyes far away now, "about an old man who got lost in the mountains during a snowstorm. That made her look at him just a little. He crashed," he continued, "in a place no one should have been flying. It was cold, he was hurt, and he thought no one would ever find him." He paused, but someone did. A young woman, strong, tough, didn't say much. She patched him up and dragged him through the snow. 2 days, no sleep, no help. Lily blinked slowly, her grip on Mr. Bear softened. "She saved his life," he said, "and when it was over, she disappeared like a ghost." "Was it real?" Lily asked quietly. He looked at her. every word. She studied his face for a long moment, then leaned her head back against the wall. "That's a good story," she murmured. He smiled. A while later she spoke again. "Do you have a name?" He hesitated. "Harrison. That's a grown-up name." "Guilty." She looked at his hat, resting on his lap. "You're the man with the old hat." He chuckled. "That's what they call me." "I do," she said, then yawned. "It's easier." The waiting room was quiet again, but the silence had changed. Softer now, warmer, the kind that doesn't feel empty, just calm. She slid sideways, her head resting on the armrest. Mr. Bear tucked beneath her chin again. He thought she had fallen asleep. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "You're not like the others." "No," he said, settling deeper into his seat. "I suppose not." Snow tapped gently against the window as night settled in. And Harrison Ford, who had sworn years ago never to step into someone else's life again, sat beside a sleeping child who had never asked for his help, but somehow, without knowing, had broken through every wall he'd built. And in the stillness of that hospital night, something began to change, not with a declaration, not with a promise, just with a presence and an old hat. The hospital had gone quiet. Not the daytime hush of routine, but the deeper kind, the stillness that only settles after midnight. Monitors beeped in distant rooms. Footsteps echoed softly on polished linoleum. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, blurring the world beyond the glass. Inside, in a corner of the waiting room, Harrison Ford sat with one hand resting on the armrest, the other near the sleeping girl curled beside him. Lily had given up fighting sleep an hour ago. Mr. Bear lay beside her like a tired sentinel. Her breathing was steady now, but every so often her small fingers would twitch, reaching for something in dreams. Ford didn't move, didn't shift. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, hat resting on his knee. Then came the footsteps, soft, hesitant. A doctor approached, clipboard in hand. Young, mid-30s, wearing fatigue around his eyes like a second skin. He glanced at Lily, then at Ford. "I didn't want to wake her," he said quietly. Ford nodded once. "How is she?" "Her mother's stable," the doctor replied, "but there are complications." He lowered his voice and took the seat across from Ford. "She suffered internal damage we didn't catch in the first surgery. We are going to need to operate again. This time it's more delicate, neurological involvement. We'll need a vascular specialist." Ford's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A tightening. "What's the cost?" he asked. The doctor sighed. "We don't have a full figure yet, but without insurance, it's going to be significant. ICU stay, 2 specialists, post-op recovery, possibly months." Ford looked toward Lily. She murmured something in her sleep, then settled again. "She doesn't have coverage?" he asked. The doctor shook his head. "Minimal, it won't even scratch the surface." Ford didn't speak right away. He reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and typed a number from memory. It rang once, then connected. "Ray," he said, voice low, "I need something handled quietly." He stood and stepped a few feet away, lowering his voice further. "There's a woman in surgery, Rebecca Morgan. She needs a second operation. I want every expense covered, hospitals, specialists, aftercare, everything, no delays." A pause. "No, I don't want my name anywhere near it." Another pause. "She has a child. Make sure her rent is paid up a year in advance. Have someone box up her apartment, store it safe. If there are any debts, clear them. Use the discretionary fund. No trails." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat. The doctor was still seated, watching him carefully. "You a friend of the family?" he asked. Ford's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "No," he said simply. "But I owe her more than family ever could." The doctor didn't press, just nodded, then stood. "I'll notify the surgical team," he said, and walked away. Ford returned to his seat beside Lily. He adjusted the blanket that had slid from her shoulder and tucked it gently beneath her chin. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering half open. "Is Mommy back?" she mumbled. "Not yet," he whispered. "She's still resting. The doctors are taking care of her." Lily nodded, eyes closing again. "Okay, Mr. Bear says he's watching too." Ford looked at the stuffed bear. For a moment, he almost believed it. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. In all his years, on screen, in the sky, in places people forgot existed, he'd done things few ever saw. But tonight was different. There were no cameras, no crew, no applause, just a quiet room, a sleeping child. And a debt being paid not in words, but in silence. When the nurse came by an hour later, holding a clipboard, she paused at the sight of the man still sitting there. "Are you her grandfather?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No," he said, "but I'm staying." She glanced at the chart. "We'll need someone to sign authorization for the procedure." He looked down at Lily, then back at the nurse. "Give me the forms," he said. "I'll make sure it gets done." She hesitated. "You're not listed as family." He looked at her, calm but unwavering. "I'm not family," he said again, "but she once saved my life, and now it's my turn." The nurse studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He watched her walk away, then turned his gaze back to the little girl beside him. No fanfare, no spotlight, just one man doing what needed to be done. When no one was watching, the ICU was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitors and the muted light from a single lamp in the corner. Machines hummed in rhythm, steady but fragile, like a heartbeat echoing through a vast, quiet canyon. Harrison Ford sat beside the hospital bed, his chair pulled close to the rail, elbows resting on his knees, hands folded loosely. He wasn't wearing his hat now. It rested on the floor beside his boots. Across the room, Lily slept curled in a waiting chair, her small frame wrapped in a borrowed blanket, Mr. Bear tucked tightly beneath her chin. Her legs dangled over the edge, too short to touch the ground. She hadn't made it through the last chapter of the story he was telling. Her eyelids had fluttered once, and then she was gone, breathing slow and even. Ford turned his attention back to the woman in the bed. Rebecca lay still beneath the blankets, her face pale, bruised at the temple where her head had struck the dashboard. Tubes fed her oxygen. A line ran into her arm. Her chest rose and fell, a motion half hers and half borrowed from the machine beside her. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the bed rail. "You probably don't remember me," he said softly, voice just above a whisper. "I barely remembered you, until today." He paused, glancing at the door to make sure they were still alone. Then he looked back down at her. "It was 5 years ago, Wind River Range, midwinter. I'd gone down hard, clipped a ridge on descent. Woke up with half a rib cage and a dislocated shoulder. The snow was already covering the wreck." His fingers rubbed absently along his left wrist, where the old scar still lingered. "They said the weather was too bad to send anyone in. Said I'd have to wait." He let out a dry laugh, quiet and sharp. "But you didn't wait. You showed up with a med pack, a radio that barely worked, and a look in your eyes like you weren't planning on losing anyone that day. You didn't ask questions, you didn't hesitate, you just got to work." He let the silence stretch for a beat, listening to the faint rhythm of the machines. "I don't remember everything. The fever hit me on the second night. But I remember the sled you built. I remember your voice yelling at me to stay awake. And I remember your name written on the wrap you used on my shoulder." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded cloth again. Unfolded it slowly, held it in both hands like something sacred. "Ah, Morgan," he whispered. Then, gently, he placed the bandage on the table beside her. "I never found you after that. You disappeared before I could say thank you. Before I could even ask who you really were." His voice caught slightly, just for a moment. "And now here we are." He sat back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. "I don't know what brought you to this town. I don't know what kind of life you've had since then, but I do know one thing." He looked toward Lily, who shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent, then settled again. "You have a daughter," he said, "and she's brave. Just like you." His gaze returned to Rebecca, eyes quiet, steady. "And I made a promise, not out loud, not to anyone, but the moment I realized who you were, I knew I owe you my life, and I intend to repay it." He reached into his coat again, pulled out a small folded piece of paper. A letter, no envelope, just handwriting on a white sheet, written the night before while Lily was sleeping in the hotel room beside him. He placed the letter gently on the edge of the bed, near her pillow, weighed down with the bandage. Then he leaned closer, his voice just a breath. Rebecca, you once pulled me out of the snow, out of death. Now it's my turn. He stood slowly, walked to Lily, gently adjusted her blanket, picked up Mr. Bear, who had fallen to the floor, and tucked him back under her arm. Then he returned to the bed, stood there for a long moment, looking down at the woman who had saved him. I'm not a hero, he whispered. I'm just a man who owes a debt to someone far braver than he'll ever be. He didn't wait for a reply. Didn't need one, she was still unconscious. But it didn't matter, because some promises aren't made for the ears of the living, they're made for the heart, and they're kept, even when no one hears. The light in the ICU was soft, filtered through blinds half closed against the morning sun. Machines beeped steadily, rhythms layered in a quiet chorus of survival. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world was white and still. Inside, everything waited. Rebecca Morgan stirred. At first, it was a twitch in her fingers, then a flicker behind her eyelids. Her chest rose with a slightly deeper breath, as if her body was testing its own strength. Slowly, painfully, her eyes opened. The room swam in and out of focus. The ceiling, the shadows, the quiet hum around her. Then a voice, "Mommy." Rebecca turned her head, sluggish, dizzy. The motion pulled at the oxygen tube beneath her nose. The world tilted again. Lily's face appeared beside the bed, wide-eyed, cheeks flushed, hair tangled with sleep. Her voice was filled with joy, but not noise, not chaos. Just the quiet certainty of a child who had waited too long for her mother to come back. "Mommy," she whispered again, "you're awake." Rebecca blinked, her lips parting dry. Her voice barely made it out. "Hi, baby." A tear slipped down Lily's cheek. "The man with the old hat took care of me," she said, as if that explained everything. Rebecca frowned slightly, her gaze shifted past Lily, and then she saw him. Standing in the corner of the room, hands in the pockets of his coat, his hat pulled low, silent, watching, like a sentinel waiting for something he didn't want credit for. At first, he was just a silhouette to her, a shape in the shadows. But then, the way he stood, the quiet in his eyes, the line of his jaw older now, but still carved with purpose. And then his voice, not loud, just a single sentence spoken days ago through fevered memory, "Don't close your eyes." "We're not done yet." Her throat caught. "You," she said, barely more than breath. "You were the one in the snow." He didn't move, just nodded once. She blinked at him, as though trying to bring a memory into sharper focus. "I thought I imagined you," she whispered. "You didn't," he said. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, whether from emotion or pain, even she didn't know. Lily looked between them, confused but smiling. "I told Mr. Bear you'd wake up," she said proudly. Rebecca reached out weakly, fingers trembling. Lily took her hand instantly, small fingers wrapping around hers. "I was scared," Rebecca said, still looking at the man in the corner. "I didn't think I'd make it." "You did," he said. "You're here." There was a silence then, not empty but full, of things unsaid, of the weight between them, the history, the gratitude, the symmetry. "I found the bandage," he added after a moment. "Still had your name on it." She closed her eyes, as if the memory had finally caught up. "I didn't think you'd remember." "I did." Another pause. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he replied. "But sometimes, life takes you back where you need to be." Lily sat quietly now, resting her head against her mother's arm. She didn't understand the full story, not yet. But children know the truth in a room. And she knew something important was happening. Rebecca turned her head toward him again. "Why," she began, "why help us?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at the girl, then back at Rebecca. "Because once," he said, "you walked into a storm to save a stranger. No questions, no reward." She waited, "And because some debts," he finished, "aren't debts at all, they're chances to do what's right." She closed her eyes again, this time not from pain, but from peace. When she opened them, he was already turning to go. "Wait," she called, voice weak but urgent. He stopped. "I never knew your name." He paused, then looked back. "Harrison," he said. A flicker of a smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Harrison." He nodded. Lily sat up straight. "Will we see you again?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time, then knelt down beside her chair. "Only if you promise to take care of Mr. Bear," he said. She grinned. "I always do." He gave her a soft smile, then stood. At the door, the nurse passed him a chart, eyes wide with questions. He didn't stop, just nodded once and kept walking. Back in the room, Rebecca looked at the letter folded neatly beside her pillow. She hadn't seen it before. With trembling fingers, she reached for it, unfolded. Read, "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who owes a debt to someone far braver than he'll ever be, and I'll be here for as long as I'm needed." She pressed the paper to her chest, tears sliding silently across her cheeks. Outside, the wind picked up again, swirling snow across the glass, but inside there was warmth. A circle closed, a storm passed, and a promise quietly kept. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.